First, we're going to talk about what rights are. We're going to talk about civil and political rights, and we're going to talk about our broken rights and how to fix them. Arguably, this lecture should be called "What Are Your Rights?" but that's what the title is. So, let's give the definition of a right. A right is an action, item, amenity, or service that cannot be denied of an individual. So, by saying that someone has the right to blank, that means no one can keep them from getting that thing. Now, it should be noted that different cultures, different societies in both place and time have different ideas as to what is and is not a right. So, what does the United States today think is completely unconscionable in denying someone is very different than, say, what Egypt in the year 1000 BC thought was those same kind of things. Additionally, there are ideas in terms of who grants or how rights are granted. Are they granted by God? Are they granted by a government? Are they granted by very virtue of being a human being? The most famous of these statements of rights in the United States being from the Declaration of Independence, that first line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, as in obvious, that all men," yeah, there's argument over that one, "are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So the statement at kind of the beginning of the United States stated that everybody, hypothetically, again, we're going to say, what are all men? Everybody is created equal, that God did it, again, according to these documents, and everyone has the right to life, the right to self-determination, usually what liberty means, and the right of the pursuit of happiness, to at least try to be happy. And we can get very philosophical with all of that, but that's just the most basic explanation. Now, in the scope of human history, the idea that individuals have rights is actually relatively new. This did not come into being part of our society until an era known as the Enlightenment that occurred during the 1700s. And of course, it sounds like a long time ago, but I love to emphasize that human history has been about 300,000 years, right? So just since the year 1700 is not that long ago. The Enlightenment movement gave rise to certain concepts that really have shaped our society. The scientific method, what is and is not science, and the idea that science is the best way to figure stuff out, that came out of the Enlightenment. The idea of personal liberty, the idea that you can determine your own fate, right? That is an Enlightenment idea. The idea of the separation of church and state, as in religion and government are different things, right? That is a new idea according to the Enlightenment. And if you want the numbers, it took place in Europe from 715 to 1789. Thus, the American Revolution was very much a Enlightenment adjacent phenomena. So prior to the Enlightenment, common people were often thought of as belonging to the land. So as such, if you were a common person, you were required to be a farmer, and you had to give a dramatic portion of your crop to feudal lords. Basically, you were allowed to live your life as long as you produced the crop that the Lord said you had to produce. The person, the Lord, almost always a man, was left you alone, basically. Didn't really care much about you as long as you paid him when money came due. Honestly, the concept of mafia extortion money, if you understand that, pretty similar to how most Europeans were required to live during that era. However, practices such as serfdom were seen as, okay, so for this reason, practices such as serfdom were seen as highly offensive to Enlightenment thinkers and those people called the Founding Fathers. Because of that couple hundred years before then, they thought, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're in a new country. We're going to do new things. But then you come up against the contradictions of race as they existed in that era of American history, and the fact that millions of people were kept as enslaved in a condition that's actually worse than European serfs were being kept in. And so we have those inherent contradictions as far as rights, you as a person, what does it mean to be human? All of those sorts of ideas were things that had to be ironed out during the 1800s into the 1900s, and we're still having issues with that today, unfortunately. Over time, though, rights started to be thought of as being granted to citizens by governments. So while it is in the documents that established the United States, allusions to rights being granted by God, eventually, and mostly in our society today, unless you take a very literalist interpretation of the Constitution, which most scholars don't, we now see rights in the United States being granted by the government itself, and that is the more modern conception there. So, by virtue of being a citizen, you are granted rights. That came to be the beginning of the 20th century concept, and that is going to evolve again, as we're going to see in a moment. And it should be pointed out then that as countries developed industrially, scientifically, philosophically, those countries actually developed different ideas as to what exactly rights are and what rights are not. So, for example, in the 1950s, American citizens had the right to free speech. And that was a much celebrated right, that you have the right to say what you think is right, etc. But Soviet citizens in the Soviet Union, now Russia, didn't. However, Soviet citizens had the right to employment. Now, there are many interpretations of what exactly that meant, and that meant different things at different times in Soviet history, but the idea there was no one can deny a person from the ability to be able to work, right? That was their idea. And American citizens did not and do not have that same right to employment, while other societies do. However, over the course of the 20th century, several events took place that called the concept of a government granting rights into question in and of itself, right? One of those key questions was, what if a society decides to make multiple gradations of citizens or multiple gradations of humans to revoke the citizenship of entire groups? So we saw this surrounding the Nazi Holocaust. We saw this surrounding American segregation in the South. We saw this in apartheid in South Africa, wherein governments, even if they were democratic, which certainly Nazi Germany was not, governments deciding this type of people are different, right? And that raised the philosophical question of, do governments or should governments have the ability to determine certain types of human beings are better or worse than other types of human beings? This increased awareness led to international cooperation in the second part of the 20th century, and the idea of human rights evolved. Human rights, it's a very common idea now in our society. It is quite popular idea. I wouldn't say it's universally accepted in the United States, but it it is a very common idea, and globally, I would say it's probably closer to being universally accepted. But those human rights are not without controversy. The main reason they're being that saying that there are human rights that cannot be denied of any human being, and especially the United Nations saying that there are in most countries people who don't like the United Nations, people who say that, well, they can't tell our country what to do, right? Now, overall, I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but it's my understanding that most societies that are part of the United Nations, the majority of people do support the United Nations. And I would then gather that most people, probably globally, do agree that human rights are indeed a thing. This idea being that by virtue of being a human being, regardless of your race, regardless of your ability, your cognitive capacity, your disability, whatever, every human being has the right to certain things. Now, I want to point out that as I've had these conversations over the years with young people, that sometimes some people have been confused by people I'll classify as angry dad types, because basically a lot of us have been yelled at in our teenage years as to what is a right and what is a privilege, right? A right, a human right, is not a privilege. A privilege can be denied of you. A human right cannot. A privilege is something that you get as a result of doing something or someone letting you do something, right? So, for example, adults have the right to go where they want. And legally in the United States, we define adults as people 18 and over. That is freedom of movement, right? You have the right to determine where your body is going to be. Now, does that mean that everyone likes that? Does that mean that your family might get angry at you? Sure, whatever, but you have the right to do that. I have the right to go to New York City today and not do any of my work and abandon my family. I'm not going to do that, but I have the right to do it. Because freedom of movement is a right. Now, a state can issue a driver's license based on an assessment of how safe a driver somebody is, right? So the state, a driver's license is indeed a privilege, as many angry dads point out, but you as a citizen, or even, it depends on the state as to whether non-citizens can do driver's licenses or not. That's a state thing. But let's assume you're a citizen. You as a citizen have the right to apply for a driver's license. And the state cannot tell you where you can or can't go, at least within your country. Those are human rights. That is freedom of movement, and that is recognized by the United Nations. It's recognized by the United States. Not every country recognizes that, but that is what we mean in terms of rights. The angry dads of the world pointing out that driving is a privilege have confused a lot of people. Just because you have a right, though, to do something does not mean that you will not be held accountable for your actions. This is where a lot of people become confused as to what exactly the freedom of speech indeed is. According to our freedom of speech, you do have the right to express yourself. You cannot be legally prevented from saying your personal opinion. However, if you make that opinion of yourself known, that does not mean that individuals don't also have the right to stop associating with you, to stop selling you things because of that opinion. Now, what is What is the right to access of a business? What is the right of the business to deny people interacting with them? That is a very complex legal thing. But let's keep it super simple. You do have the right to say anything, almost anything, as long as it doesn't put other people in harm. Some of those things could be racist, but I have the right also to not associate with you anymore if you say things that I think are highly offensive, right? Additionally, then, you do not have the right to say something that could directly get people hurt, right? The classic example is you do not have the right to scream, "There's a fire," in a crowded movie theater, because if you did, it could cause people to stampede, and indeed, people could get killed, right? You additionally do not have the right to intentionally spread lies about someone that could harm their professional reputation. That's called slander. And if you publish it, it's called libel. You don't have the right to do that. Your freedom of speech is denied if you are telling intentional things you know to be lies. And that's where it gets fuzzy, right? Where do people know something to be lie versus not know something to be lie? But you do not have the right to destroy somebody's means of making a living if you're lying. Now, if you're telling the truth and somebody is indeed doing terrible things, you do have the right to point that out, and thus, even if it is destroying their livelihood, but you do not have the right to lie about stuff like that. This all sounds absolutely obvious, right? When we say, like, the light thing, you have a freedom of speech, but once we get into the details of it, as with everything, a nuance makes things complicated. That's why a lot of people don't like nuance, but it's critical to keeping our society operating. So let's talk a bit about civil and political rights. So the Bill of Rights are the rights in the Bill of Rights are granted in the first portion of the U.S. Constitution, right after the preamble. Our rights in the United States are freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly and petition. So what we call the freedom of speech is actually a complicated set of things. In the past, the First Amendment has been considered your right to put chemical substances in your body. If you go back to the 1800s, and that was changed somewhat in the early 1900s, and now our society is changing a little bit more in that regard. But so that's just kind of an illustration of how things move over time. You have the right to keep and bear arms in order to maintain a well-regulated militia. Very controversial kind of thing, right? Just because we call something a right doesn't mean that people, it will not maintain and continue to be political. The more right-wing perception of that is everyone in the country has the right to keep a gun, right? The more left-wing, progressive version of that would be, well, we don't have militias anymore. Is this actually an obsolete kind of thing? Similarly, no quartering of soldiers, right, is the Third Amendment. People don't talk about the Third Amendment much, and to most people, that seems really obsolete too, right? But there's far less controversy there than there is surrounding the Second Amendment. Freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. Cops can't just search you no matter what. Now that, again, all of these have been political at one point or another. Right to due process of law, freedom from self-incrimination, freedom from double jeopardy. You have the right to not testify against yourself. You also have the right to testify on your behalf, but you have the right not to. And once you are found guilty or not guilty of a crime, you cannot be put on trial again. You have the right to a speedy and public trial if you are accused of a crime. You have the right to a trial by jury in civil cases. Is that accurate? No. In you have the right to a trial by jury in certain situations. Let's put it that way. I'm not a lawyer, I'm sorry. Freedom from excessive bail, cruel and unusual punishments. You have the right to not be treated horribly by the legal system, basically. That's the clumsy definition there. You have, I love the Ninth Amendment, other rights of the people. So basically what the Ninth Amendment means is that states and local areas can make decisions that certain people, that you do have rights, but states have the ability to grant additional rights then. That's where things like prior to the 2013, I believe, same-sex marriage cases, states were granting LGBTQ plus couples the ability to marry each other. That's a states' rights thing. And then 10, other powers reserved to the states. Really, 9 and 10 do work together. And of course, Americans do have other rights, but these were the ones laid out first. And there may be a time in the future when we grant people even more rights because the Constitution is a living document. Civil rights then. But you could also call these political rights. You have the right to vote. You have the right to a fair trial. You have the right to government services. You have the right to education, and you have the right to use public facilities. These civil rights concepts that need to be granted to all people did not really become part of the public discourse until the mid-1900s. This is what the civil rights movement that primarily centered on African Americans was all about, because legally these rights were being abridged specifically against the African American community. Now, it should be pointed out that there are other communities, including American Indians, who also were being denied these privileges. So the civil rights movement helped more than just African Americans, but definitely historically most of the focus was put on that specific racial group. And it should be pointed out that those ones in parentheses on here are laid out in the Constitution, and really those were the strongest holding points of that particular social movement. Political rights, then, ensure citizens can participate in governance. Things like running for office. You have the right to run for office as a citizen of the United States. You have a right to express your opinions. Again, the ones in parentheses are in the Constitution. You have a right to procedural fairness in the law. You basically have the right to be treated like other people. That you can't just be treated unfairly under the law, for example, because public opinion is against you if you're like a celebrity type. You have the right to due process. Again, the right to be treated the same. And you have the right to freedom of association. You have the right to talk to and to work with people regardless of how politically popular they are, right? Freedom of association is actually violated a whole heck of a lot more than we actually talk about, but that's a room for a different lecture. And it should be noted that there is not a super clear line between civil rights and political rights, so don't get overly concerned if, is this a civil right or is this a political right? I'm not going to ask you that. But we have this other thing called economic rights that many other societies talk about, but aren't as commonly discussed as they are in the United States. So while the idea of civil and political rights are deeply embedded in our society, the idea of economic rights are not as well developed. Partially because these ideas became more common in the industrialized world in the aftermath of World War II. So basically, the economic hardships that were put on a lot of the rest of the world during that era caused political minds, philosophical minds to start to make arguments that you can't deny human beings certain things just because of their situation, right? And the justification for this is that economic rights make society more resilient on the big picture, and poverty is not as bad on the micro level if people have economic rights. And additionally then, another reason why we were talking about economic rights, and I'll talk about what they are in a second, that these ideas really matched very well with ideas of inevitable human progress during that era. The post-World War II era was very much about, okay, we're going to become really great as a society. We're going to have jetpacks. Society will always keep getting better and better and better. That is the idea of modernism. That's the modernism idea. If you know anything about postmodernism, that's kind of what we do now as a society. But at that time, they had modernism, the idea that everything will keep getting better and better and better. Citizens of the United States, as I alluded to, are granted far fewer of these rights than our European counterparts, and this may be due to the international political conflict of the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Basically, because economic rights were discussed to a far greater degree in Europe, and because basically the socialist and Soviet bloc were pushing for economic rights very hard, then in the United States, we started to, there was a perception that economic rights means socialism, and that very much was so politically unpopular in the United States that that we just refused to even address it for about 50 years. However, I mean, again, I talk about it could have been politically different, and it should always be emphasized that when you are in a moment in history, you do not know how things are gonna go. President Roosevelt actually did propose a second Bill of Rights, which were economic rights in the United States. And this second Bill of Rights, he was saying, should be that every American should have a right to a job. Every American should have a right to an adequate wage and decent living. Every American should have the right to a decent home. Notice how we have a lot of these problems still today. Every American has the right to medical care, to economic protection during sickness, accident, old age, or unemployment. Basically, that fifth one, if you can't make your living on your own, President Roosevelt was making the argument in the 40s that we should take care of people because they are people. And then additionally, every American has a right to a good education. Now, of those, I'm looking at these right here, we kind of do number 4 a little bit, we kind of do number 5, and we kind of do number 6. But we don't do a good job of any of these as our society. And 1, 2, and 3 we do, and 4 we really don't even try. Additionally, though, during this era, we did grant some economic rights. We granted American citizens the right to form a union within certain parameters, right? Other societies have a far greater ability to form unions legally, but in the United States, we do have a right to form unions to a certain degree. We have a right to Medicare and Medicaid if you are disabled or if you're over the age of 65. Again, that's an abridged version of economic right, but that is an economic right we have as American citizens. And then the right to Social Security, the right to that certain weakened version of an old age pension that Americans get, that is far stronger in some other countries. We do have those things. So basically, if you compare us with our international colleagues, counterparts, whatever, you can, we have abridged rights in those regards. So, as I alluded to, we have some rights in our country that are kind of broken, but if you're going to think in almost a progressivist way, in a modernist way, how could we fix those? As I alluded to heavily, when we compare the rights granted to Americans of those others in the industrial world, there are some really obvious discrepancies. In particular, the international community has expressed concerns. This is kind of wild to think about. A lot of Americans don't think about this. There are people in other countries that are concerned about the well-being of Americans. That's not something that we as Americans often think about. We like to think about we are, that American exceptionalism, we're the best. We don't think about the fact that there are people in Britain, there are people in New Zealand, there are people internationally that are concerned for us because of our government. And that's kind of wild to think about, but it's true. Specifically, the international community is concerned about our quality of education, our ability to get affordable housing, and my wife as a social worker is deeply involved in what they call the housing crisis and trying to fix that, and then our right or lack of right to health care in our country. So if we want to try to fix quality education, we are actually holding the same concerns that a lot of people in the mid-1800s held. And we should be reminded that in the 1800s, there was not seen to be a right to an education because we didn't have an education infrastructure. Most schoolhouses during that era were funded by people in the community. Basically, if you wanted your kid to go to school, you as the community had to get together, had to hire a teacher, because usually you were lucky if you could get a teacher. Attendance was often casual in those schools, so like kids were not required to be in school, and if work needed to be on the farm, then that kid had to go back to the farm, because during that era it was very much a matter of survival. And this model persisted for a long time. And there are even still some traditions in American schooling that speak back to that model. The American model of a prolonged 3-month summer vacation really is not a modern idea. We all did love our summer vacations when we were kids, for sure. But social scientifically, in the theory of education, that hurts a lot of kids. It hurts a lot of kids in a big way. If you ever have kids, if you've read about this stuff, you learn that there is an education gap that is created every single summer. And the privileged kids whose parents put them in activities over the summer, they don't backslide in the things that they've learned. But those kids who aren't privileged, whose parents just say, you know what, go play. It's summer, you're supposed to go play. Unfortunately, that attitude causes kids to not retain the stuff they've learned the previous year. Now, it should be pointed out, though, that internationally, in terms of schooling, that is not to say that most countries have their kids go to school 365 days a year. That is a misconception that Americans have. The reality of the matter is that what other countries do is, instead of having that solid 3 months in the summer completely off, they break up that long vacation into smaller chunks and redistribute it throughout the year. So you might have a 2 to 3 week break in the summer, and then a 2 to 3 week break in the fall, in the winter, and then in the spring, right? They make it more equal across the school year, is how my understanding of how most countries do it, as opposed to having that very long time where it's kind of easy to forget how to read over a summer. I remember when I was a kid, and I'm going to stop here at this, I remember summers when I did not touch a pencil, period. I didn't write anything for months at a time. That could not have been good for my education. Additionally, in 2019, 90% of Americans attended public schools. And of course, this is a pre-COVID number. This could probably use updating, but We actually, to the date of me recording this, we aren't still super sure how enrollment in public schools has been impacted by COVID in the long term. It's my understanding that at this moment there has been rebound and there wasn't a massive shift to private schools, but there was probably a little bit of a shift. And then there was a much of a shift back too. Additionally, 74% of college students attend public institutions. So Ohio State is a public institution. You have the right to apply, and it is funded with government tax dollars. And there is basically, when you attend a public institution, you have more rights within that institution to tie it in. When you attend a private institution, they have some more leeway to say, no, you can't come here, right? Is basically what a lot of that comes down to. But again, it's a lot of gray territory, quite frankly. But that's not to say that our colleges are free. Our colleges are not free. Colleges are wildly expensive. But those are publicly funded institutions. And the concept there being that because they're publicly funded, hypothetically, tuition should be less. Again, the whole system's busted. But it should be pointed out additionally that by virtue of getting a college education in the United States, we are world class in terms of the education we do in the United States. A lot of times the American education system is downplayed and beaten up in all kinds of ways, and for just reason. But we do have some of the best K through 12 schools in the world. Unfortunately, we also have some of the worst. But our college systems are one of the best, so I guess if you've made it this far, good for you. But if we could change some of the public school systems in the United States, it would really help tremendously. As discussed in previous lectures, our schools are funded via property taxes, and this is a big problem with the United States and that inequity, right? We have some of the best schools, we also have some of the worst schools. That shouldn't really be. But if we wanted to equalize that, what we would have to do is take all of the property taxes, at least within a state, and ideally across the country, and then redistribute those property taxes equally to every single school. As it is now, if you live in an area with high property values that bring in more taxes, because the more something is worth, the more percentage, the greater that number is, right? So 5% of $200 million is a whole lot more than 5% of $50,000, right? So rich kids basically get good schools, poor kids basically get bad schools, is how that goes down in most cases. And then that poor funding leads to how teachers aren't paid very well. It leads to technology not necessarily being the best. It leads to, facilities falling apart, etc. It's really a very unequal kind of thing. If you grew up in a rich area, you probably went to a really good school. If, like me, you grew up in a poor area, you probably grew up in a real bad school. So to give you some statistics, the wealthiest 10% of public school districts spend 10 times more than the lowest 10% of public school districts, to put that into perspective. And this is just within the public system, not even talking about private schools. And then students in poor districts then very much are less able to compete in terms of getting into those colleges. If you're going to talk about fairness, if you're going to talk about class discrimination, really look at admissions in colleges. It's really an area where the privileged really have a tremendous benefit. One fix, as I alluded to, could be that we could equally distribute those monies. An alternate fix is and has been to bus students from poor school districts to rich schools. There is a lot of controversy surrounding that. The biggest controversy in the latter part of the 20th century was actually quite racist. Today, sure, there are still some racist implications there in terms of busing, but today it's more about if kids are bused from the poor schools to the rich schools, then those poor schools often lose a lot of their funding. So the kids that get stuck in those poor schools get poorer and poorer and poorer educations. So it's really not a perfect fix by any stretch of the imagination. The lack of affordable housing is another major problem in our country. Affordable housing is defined as costing no more than 30% of the person's income. So you are in an affordable housing situation if, let's say you make $1,000 a month, you are paying no more than $300 a month for rent or mortgage. And you know very well that, well, maybe you do. I don't know where you are in your life course, but $300 a month for rent would be a wildly low rent, right? You can't basically find anywhere to live. If you make $1,000 a month, you need to find somebody else to get with, because like that you can't afford rent anywhere effectively. It's really very bad. Many housing projects in the early 20th century were built for people that could not afford the rent, right? Unfortunately, those places were not maintained, and many of those places have been overcome by crime, have been overcome by the buildings just breaking down over time, and we haven't replaced them. There was a place in Columbus, Ohio called Poindexter Village where a lot of poor people lived, where and that kept them, in a house for a long time. But eventually, powerful entities, including the OSU medical system, took over Poindexter Village and kind of enveloped it into their properties and basically tore down all those people's homes. And there was not a corresponding rebuilding of a different place. Those people basically had to fend for themselves. And that's just one example, not only in the city of Columbus, but around the state and around the country. We just aren't trying to help poor people live in affordable housing. So how do we fix that? Oh, sorry, still talking about how terrible it is. Additionally, over the last 50 years, economies, the pay scale for the poorest Americans and even working class Americans has gone down significantly. A big reason for that is that we have seen a decline in union jobs, mainly because we shifted from a manufacturing economy to a service economy in this country. And with that, we have not seen, well, we've seen some. We've seen some growth in union representation in service work, but that growth has been much slower, mainly because the bosses aren't dumb. They learned how to break unions in the later part of the 20th century, and the laws in our country became increasingly anti-union as the rich and powerful became more and more powerful in our society in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then all of these lower pay things has contributed to making more and more and more people either homeless or living in very poor living conditions. This impacts individuals by being forced to put all of their money into rent, as opposed to being able to put that money into food, into clothing, transportation, healthcare. This can harm children in terms of lead poisoning. Poor areas have disproportionately high rates of lead poisoning, and lead poisoning, this is just one factor, can cause some serious lifelong both physical implications and intellectual implications. If the lead is too high in your water because at one time we made water pipes out of lead, and if those pipes haven't been replaced in 50 years, they might still be made of lead, right? Those areas where infrastructure has broken down, and there's a lot of those areas still, and that can cause brain damage in young kids, and that kind of issues in your intellectual capacity can be quite harmful. We could fix it by making more lower cost housing, right? We could rebuild those housing projects. Would probably have to change the name because housing projects has a bad name due to reputation, but we could build more houses. We can fix things. We can help people as a society. And then, of course, by building those places, that would create more construction jobs for people. It would create more jobs for people as a whole. Personally, I think that we should buy up the abandoned condominiums that are in most cities. Most high-end condominiums only have about a 60% fill rate, so a lot of those places are just sitting empty, while there are in any city hundreds, maybe thousands of people who are homeless. Why can't we just let them in those places and not freeze to death? Like, this is the kind of thing that makes me very, very angry. Additionally, we could provide housing vouchers. This is another thing we could do. Currently, government subsidies only apply to housing that building houses over $1 million. So yeah, we do give money to building housing, but only if the housing is building the house is over $1 million. So you can see how that only really helps people who are very well off. If we were to lower that to $500,000 in building a house and giving those subsidies, and $500,000 is still a massive amount of money, it would help middle and working class Americans be able to build those houses in a more fair way. So we could do it in that regard. So we do have housing subsidies, but we only really give them to upper middle and upper class people. Additionally, then, we can expand housing voucher systems. So there are vouchers for people who are poor, but that system is very poorly funded. It's incredibly hard to get a voucher. If you can get a voucher, it's even harder to find a landlord that will accept a voucher like that. And that in and of itself is often illegal, but that doesn't keep landlords from breaking the law in that regard. We could create a better housing credit for lower income people. So we basically could adjust this law that is to keep people in houses, but actually make it really able to help poor people. We could do that. And we could enforce the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So the Fair Housing Act is intended to make it so that landlords can't refuse you because you have a housing voucher. But again, it's not, the law is not followed. For example, if you are a renter, it really does benefit you to learn the law surrounding rentals, because a lot of landlords break those laws all the time. There's kind of a bit of personal advice. There are some good landlords, but there are also some absolute criminals. Additionally, healthcare is a big problem in the United States. One of the major reasons, it used to kind of work, unfortunately. In the mid-20th century, when you could get a job and stay at that job for your whole career, then it made sense that your health care would be tied with your job, because it would just stay there your whole life, right? That's where the system came from, with health insurance being tied to employment. However, that doesn't exist anymore. And because I personally have 3 employers, right? And for each of those employers, I am a quote part-time worker, even though I work full-time, for example. And I'm a university professor, for God's sake. You know, if I can't get health insurance, who else can't get health insurance, right? It's absurd the way our system actually is. And we need to rethink and redo it. We've done some rethinking and redoing. The Affordable Care Act, the thing that's called Obamacare, in 2009 did help a lot, but we still have a tremendous way to go. And as I alluded to, if you can afford health care in the United States, it's great. It's really good. We have tremendous capacity to give people health care. We have tremendous technology to figure out what is wrong with you. However, most people can't afford to access that stuff without going into debt. This is a revolutionary concept, but you shouldn't be driven into debt because you get cancer. Shocking idea, right? Additionally, healthcare in the United States is unique in this regard. This just isn't how it is in other countries, and I just like to point that out because if you have an international perspective, if you know what's going on in other countries, it's really easy and justified as an American citizen to get very angry at the things that are being denied of us. As I alluded to, the Affordable Care Act did make really substantial progress in this regard. It made health insurance rates more competitive. If you thought they were bad now, they used to be worse. Additionally, it eliminated this thing that was called a pre-existing condition. Pre-existing conditions were quite evil. There's no other word for it. Basically, if you were found to have a health condition, and then you like a heart condition, right? And you lost your health insurance and had to get new health insurance, your insurance company could say, no, we're not giving you insurance because you have a pre-existing heart condition. And it could be that no insurance company would pick you up because of that heart condition. Thank goodness the Affordable Care Act did get rid of that largely, and that was a big improvement. But healthcare is still unaffordable for many people, and the United States still does not offer universal single-payer healthcare coverage like most of our international counterparts. How do we fix this? We can expand Medicare to all Americans who want it. What does that mean? Well, Medicare is a system that is open to older Americans over the age of 65 years. And then Medicaid is also offered to people with disabilities. What if we had that same system that is underfunded and we fully funded it? We could give everyone health insurance. We absolutely can do that. The only reason we don't do that is because there is not the political will to do it. And a good way that we could make this pass and make it actually happen is absolutely still give people the right to maintain their health insurance as it is. If you like your current health insurance, keep it. That was a big driver in the Affordable Care Act, and it maintained, but there are still provisions in there that that we really could still be better. There's a lot of room still for improvement. Okay. This lecture is currently at about 53 minutes. It'll be longer than that by the time I'm done talking. I think we've done our job well here. If you have any questions, please let me know.